So let's talk some noble paragons in super heavy Titanic mech suits, with an overview of the strengths and weaknesses of every Imperial Knights unit. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Imperial Knights, and in this video I thought we'd take a look over the contents of the index, both for the standard Knights and their Forge World units, talk through each datasheet, a few of the pros and cons of fielding it versus the rest, and how I'd rate their in-game strength right now in a very arbitrary rating out of 10. Let's go through the core index units first, then move into the Imperial Armour Index with all the Cerastus and the Acastus chassis and things, and try and weigh up each of these adamantium behemoths. First up, let's start on a high note with the Armiger Warglaives. They pretty much always tend to be a really important unit for the Imperial Knights, given that they tend to be the cheapish frontline foot soldiers, currently 150 points each, and they're battle line vehicle units. Armigers in general move fast at 12 inches and have got a good OC8. Being quite cheap units, they make good use of the Code Chivalric Lay Low the Tyrant rerolls for 1 hit and 1 wound, particularly with that scary thermal spear for these guys. They almost always tend to be necessary in knight armies, as they're the units that you can hopefully have taking damage first from the enemy, rather than your bigger investment huge knights. And also if you need things to hold objectives, do actions, or hunt down outlying units, it's often going to fall to the Armigers rather than the 400 plus point Titanic Knights. They also have a fair few synergies with their bondsman abilities. For the Armiger Warglaives in particular, they get their strong anti-tank gun with that thermal spear. Melter 4 up close is particularly nasty, and means that even a stray shot from one of these could really punch above its weight. Their melee maybe isn't standout against any one target, but is nicely general purpose, and again makes good use of those rerolls, and they get sustained hits when they charge in as well. They can use quite a lot of the various bondsman abilities quite well. I feel like maybe one of the very best for them might be the Warden's -1 damage. That's pretty much exactly what you want on a unit that's pushing out to a mid-board objective and likely to take a bunch of enemy damage. And maybe more so than the Helverins, they can get good value out of either the Stubber or the Melter gun, depending on whether or not you want a few more spammed anti-infantry type shots or further armor busting hit. I guess by their nature they do have a few downsides. They're going to be less efficient for big synergy stratagems like say rotate ion shields, and they're still not really all that cheap for an outlying unit to screen with. You can still be losing a lot of points when one of these goes down. Plus they perhaps are a little bit less good at interacting with terrain versus the big knights now, given that they can't go straight through it where they can. Still though, I feel like these guys are absolutely essential to an Imperial Knight army list. Pretty much every army tends to take them in good numbers between good synergy, fairly good threat, and being the nice outlying units to trade over midfield objectives. I've given them the full 10 out of 10 here. Before we move on to the rest, I thought I'd just briefly mention the channel's August giveaway, which is for a knight household. Each month on the channel I do some big giveaways for model kits. The August one will be for 3 winners to get a custom knight household posted out to them. Basically the rules are that you can choose any 3 plastic knights made by Games Workshop, any combination of Imperial or Chaos, and any 1 big knight can be swapped out for 4 Armigers or War Dogs if you like. Hopefully it should be a good way for a few people to start a new army of around about 1500 points. As per normal, there'll be 2 equal ways to enter this, both of them links down in the video description. Either you can support the channel on Patreon for any amount, that gives you automatic entry each month, and of course is the main thing that allows me to do this as my full-time job. Or you can support via social media completely for free, subscribe to the YouTube channel and like the Facebook page, and then to actually enter the draw, a Facebook post appears on the 1st of August. Respond to that with a photo of any 40k mini or imagery, along with your name and the date, handwritten within the same photo, the last bit just to deter Facebook bots and spammers. Then after all that's done, I put all the entries into a random number generator. Each person gets 1 entry equally, whether they chose to go with Patreon or social media, and then I pull out the winners and announce the draw on the channel update video around the 4th of August. I'll post the models after you've told me which ones you want and I've received my orders of them. In any case, there'll be further giveaways every month, but feel free to check out the links down in the video description if you'd like to enter for this one. Getting back to the knight units though, next up let's talk about the Armiger Helverins. 140 points for the gun turret version of the Armiger Warglaives, sporting 8 autocannon shots at strength 9, AP 1 and damage 3. They're also pretty fast and have got a good amount of objective control, often can be a good choice for babysitting home objectives given their long range on those guns. And I feel like the autocannons are interesting to have as a bit of a counterpoint to lots of high power anti-tank fire, Some targets they're just absolutely excellent against. Things like certain orcs, demons, or Drukhari models do really well, and they can also gain anti-fly 2+ if they're in your deployment zone or on objectives, and that could be really good for certain targets like Catan. They get on quite well with that Squire's Duty stratagem as well, the one for extra AP when you're shooting things, and that's kind of big on AP1 autocannons. I'd say that's maybe one of their biggest weaknesses. They can be pretty underwhelming, firing against say 2+ or 3+ saves in cover. The vast majority of damage is likely to bounce. Otherwise, for bondsman abilities, they could get on quite well with the Crusaders +1 to hit 1, or the Castigators extra AP and sustained hits. They both work out quite well for them. And otherwise for weaknesses, I guess getting tagged in melee isn't the most helpful for them, maybe needing to stand and shoot in close combat or fall back and forgo shooting. Still though, I think between all of that they can be really quite a nice complement to Warglaives. Most people tend to have the majority of their Armigers as Warglaives, and then perhaps a slightly lesser number of Helverins doing fire support, but I still think that it's nice enough to have a mix of both. I feel like they are easily worth it at 140 points, I've given them a 9 out of 10 here. Moving on to the Questoris variants, these are toughness 12 with 22 wounds, big hefty Titanic Knights that are really quite efficient for unit stratagems. They're characters so they can take enhancements, and they now have that ability to be able to walk through terrain pieces, just risking the possibility of battle shock. For all the variants that get big melee weapons, their close combat can be really quite scary. Both Paragon Gauntlets and Reaper Chainswords are pretty nasty, and in general for Carapace weapons most tend to go for the Storm Spear missile pod. Throwing out an extra 3 crack missiles definitely doesn't hurt. In general for Questoris, I feel like as with most Titanic things, just having all of your value concentrated in one model can be a downside. They can only be in so many places at once. And in general, most of the time you don't really want the Questoris Knights right on the front line straight away against the enemy's strongest damage dealers. Particularly in close combat they can go down rather easily given that they lack an invulnerable save there. Finally getting onto the Errant in particular, it is quite a cheap one at 405 points. It gets a big 2d3, enormous melter gun with 24-inch range and the melter 6 rule, which is kind of crazy. And it also gets +1 to hit when it's shooting the closest thing as well, which basically means that it wants to get really close to the enemy's biggest, nastiest threat and melt it to death. Maybe could be an okay one for that mysterious guardian trait to have it teleport across the board to do so. Its other ability is the Bondsman one to give the Armigers advance and shoot. That could be helpful for either of them, though feels particularly nice for Warglaives trying to rush up the boards to get to objectives and things. I think maybe the biggest downside for the Knight Errant is that it's maybe just a little bit underwhelming. Unless you can get in that big Melter 6 range, it is kind of close range and will really need to play aggressively quite a lot more than the others. I still think it's solid enough though. I've chosen to rate it a 7 out of 10 here. I've certainly seen occasional tournament lists using them. Next up we've got the Knight Paladin, again 405 points following a points decrease in the latest update. This guy packs the rapid fire battle cannon, so potentially 2d6 plus 6 shots at rapid fire range, which is 36 inches, so kind of likely to get that, all at strength 10, AP 1 and damage 3. His bondsman ability I think is particularly nice. Lethal hits and lance is quite nice on literally any of the armigers that you can put it on. An extra heavy stubber doesn't hurt too much either, and it gets a further reroll 1 dice each phase, and it can be hits, wounds and saves, so it gets another valuable reroll above and beyond the Lay Low the Tyrants ones. I'd say the main issue for the Paladin is the AP 1 on the battle cannon, can just mean that in certain matchups it's not going to be quite as good as others. Still though, with 13 shots and all those rerolls, it's definitely going to stack a fair few saves on most enemy targets, just maybe not quite as reliably good against big tanks and vehicles. I've seen a couple of people running these in competitive lists since the balance update came out, and they went down in points a bit. I'd rate him kind of similarly to the Errant. I've chosen to give him a 7.5 out of 10 here. Maybe just feels like he's a little bit more exciting after that points decrease. Next up, the Knight Warden is the one with the Avenger Gatling cannon. He's got 18 shots at strength 6, AP 2 and damage 2, so it's basically Death Incarnate to Space Marine equivalents, and even gets devastating wounds to make him a bit more threatening against other tough infantry. The Gatling cannon also gets a built-in heavy flamer, and I feel like his bondsman ability is a particularly good one for -1 damage. As mentioned, that's just what you want on armigers taking the midboard. Means that a lot of damage to things that might have wrecked them before just bounce. He has a big 450 points though, and that strength 6 profile will underwhelm against certain really quite tough targets. Anything it's wounding on a 5+ isn't going to be all that exciting. I can see why it maybe costs a bit more than the other Questoris variants, but another 45 points is kind of painful. I haven't seen too many people using them, though I still think they're solid enough. I've chosen to rate the Warden a 7 out of 10 here. Next up, the Knight Gallant is the melee Questoris and the single cheapest one. He moves a bit faster than most with a 12-inch move, and certainly really enjoys his newfound ability to smash straight through large bits of terrain. Perhaps one of the bigger winners from the super heavy change. When he gets to melee, he's got fairly huge attacks, with 5 attacks hitting at a big range of profiles depending on whether or not you want anti-marine, anti-terminator or anti-heavy. He'll quite like Valiant Last Stand, the fight on death type stratagem. Gets -1 to hit in melee, which isn't too bad for fighting on the front line, as he'll often be winding up in combat. And reroll charges and reroll hits in melee is a fairly nice boost for Armiger Warglaives charging in alongside. I feel like he is usable enough, can just throw himself in, being a slightly more expendable one on the points cost, and certainly threaten to wreck whatever he gets close unless the enemy pays attention and brings him down. Though I feel like not having an invulnerable save in close combat is a bit of a downside to him, and he certainly feels like he's in big competition for the Knight Lancer, who's just 30 points more. I feel like for the upgrade, being faster and getting a 4+ invulnerable save and free tank shock probably outweigh the Gallant's abilities, and I feel like there's not going to be too many people taking the Gallant over the Lancer in competitive lists. For that way, for just being a little bit overshadowed, I've chosen to rate him a 6 out of 10. I'm not sure if that's a little bit harsh. Now he can break through walls in the way that he can. Maybe he should have been a 7. Next up, the Knight Crusader is 445 points. He gets 2 scary gun profiles, 1 Gatling cannon, and then either the big thermal cannon or the rapid fire battle cannon from the Errant or the Paladin, both of which are pretty scary in their own right, depending on whether or not you want to crack tanks and vehicles or just spam out loads more shots. Pretty crazy that he could be throwing around something like 30 to 40 odd fairly scary profile shots each time he shoots. He gives a +1 to hit as a bondsman ability, which is nice for any of them, but particularly nice for the Armiger Helverins. Certainly keeps them very accurate in their fire support. He gets sustained hits if he's ever static, though I feel like it's very rare that you can afford to do that with a 445 point model in a 40k game. Most of the time they need to be pushing to objectives or moving around to get line of sight unless you're playing on a completely open battlefield. And he might be a good choice for Mysterious Guardian to allow him to get line of sight on the things that he most needs to. For other downsides, he might struggle with heavily armoured targets unless he takes the Thermal Spear, in which case he might have some slightly mixed priorities as he needs to get a lot closer than he might need to otherwise. He is pricier than the majority of Questoris, and he does have the weakness to melee. If he gets tied up, then he could have some difficult decisions, not being able to move and go to objectives or gain line of sight on things, so just having to stand and shoot and hope that Gatling cannon can clear out whatever was tagging him, or choose to fall back and give up shooting. Haven't seen too many people running Crusaders. They were really popular towards the start of 10th edition when their firepower was just kind of obscene and the towering rule was super powerful. Overall though, I still rate them as usable. I've chosen to give the Crusader a 7 out of 10. Next up, we've got the Knight Preceptor, the one with the Las Impulsor. This one's another fairly cheap variant at 405 points. The Las Impulsor is either D6 strength 14 damage 4 shots, or 2d6 strength 7 damage 2, so it's fairly flexible. He gives a boost for leadership and objective control to his Warglaives, and his ability is to choose one enemy unit at the start of the game and get 4 rerolls to hit against them. At the moment I'd say he's probably the weakest out of the Questoris. The Las Impulsor is alright, but maybe just a little bit jack of all trades, but not particularly exciting against any one target. The reroll thing is alright, but kind of depends on how the game folds out, and if that unit gets slain then it basically means that he doesn't have an ability for the rest of the game, and say his bondsman ability just is a bit so-so. Perhaps above all of that though, upgrading to Canis Rex for 30 points just seems like a total no-brainer. The amount of extra stuff that he gets for that upgrade is pretty crazy. Overall I've chosen to rate him a 5 out of 10, certainly numbering amongst one of the weakest of the big knights of the Codex I think. Talking of Canis Rex though, for the extra 30 points, you basically get a Knight Preceptor but you don't get the Storm Spear rocket pod on top, though his damage is just much better overall. He hits on a 2+, with sustained hits on a 5+, which often means that you get far more hits than you have attacks from things like the Las Impulsor or Freedom's Hand. What's kind of crazy about his melee though is that he basically hits the same sort of power as a Knight Gallant, hitting on a 2 with those sustained hits on a 5+ once more, and he even gets +1 damage on the strike mode. Between all that and a general purpose weapon, he's just fairly fantastically dangerous, quite nice at range, but particularly in melee. Then beyond that, his free stratagem rule became fairly godly in the last balance update, -1 CP to any stratagems out there, so you can use it on things like rotate ion shields or tank shock or CP rerolls for just extra damage or charge rolls and things. It's pretty massive that he can do that every turn as well, so it's not even just once per battle round. Then if he ever does just get shot down, then Sir Hector can get out to be annoying and maybe do scoring things, or just preserve the whole Slay the Warlord type thing. Might not always matter too much, and he could get wiped out by enemy units, but he is just one more thing that the enemy needs to think about and try and destroy. Overall, he just feels like he's head and shoulders above the majority of the Questoris. I guess for negatives, he doesn't get a Storm Spear pod, and he's not really any more massively tough than the other knights, aside from the odd reroll saves or free rotate ion shields. Might mean that you want to play just a little bit more careful with him than some of the rest, given that you want to keep that great damage output alive turn on turn. Overall, he's a top tier knight, tends to make his way into pretty much all competitive lists. I've chosen to rate him a 10 out of 10. Next up, we've got the great big walking gun platforms that are the Dominus Knights. They're a fair bit tankier than the Questoris, toughness 13, so las cannons will wound them on a 5+, 24 wounds and a 2+ save are all very good things, particularly when they get cover. They have a pair of twin melter guns for a bit of point defense, and then some twin siege breaker cannons and some devastating wound missiles on the carapace, and you can skew a bit more towards the anti-armor or being a bit more well-rounded against some light infantry as you please. The Dominus Knights also give armigers cover nearby when they're within 6 inches. That can be handy, but cover isn't really the hardest thing to get in 10th edition most of the time. The main downsides is that they're huge points investment. As they're both over 500 points, they both really need to make a serious impact on the game, destroy lots of enemies early, and take out some seriously powerful things with their big weaponry, and if they don't, then it could just be points over invested. They're also slow moving at 8 inches and don't really have anything good in melee. In particular, the Knight Castellan doesn't want to get caught in melee due to its blast weapons, as it won't be able to shoot the things that have tagged it. For the Knight Castellan specifically though, it is just fairly fearsome anti-tank and anti-elite sort of firepower. The Plasma Decimator spits out a whole bunch of Strength 9, AP 3 and Damage 3 attacks, quite nice for handling things like Terminators and Space Marines, and then the Volcano Lance has got the slightly crazy D3 shots at Strength 18, AP 5 and Damage D6 plus 8. Pretty much the best thing to fire against any enemy heavy armor, where even 2+ saves in cover aren't going to have much of a chance to bounce this. That gets on really well with the Lay Low the Tyrant's rerolls, hit and wounds. The Castellan also gets to reroll damage results of Warn against monsters and vehicles as well, good for the Volcano Lance, Melter Guns and the Shield Breakers. Overall, I feel like it does its job quite well as an anti-tank and anti-elite big investment gun turret. I think they're usable enough at the 525 points. The risk of being tagged in melee could be really quite frustrating for getting it where it wants to be or needing other things to help bail it out. I've chosen to rank the Castellan a 7.5 out of 10. If the enemy's got a lot of armor, knights and elite infantry, then it's not going to be the sort of thing that they want to see on the other side of the table. Otherwise, for the Dominus chassis, we've got the Knight Valiant, 530 points for the same chassis with a big flamer and a big harpoon. The Conflagration Cannons, 3d6 hits at Strength 8, AP 1 and Damage 2 with Ignore Cover, so quite nasty against enemy medium infantry. And then that crazy harpoon has got a massive Damage 12 with Anti-Vehicle 4+ and Devastating Wounds. Both of those are just 18-inch range though, so it does have to get pretty close to either infantry or enemy tanks and vehicles if it wants to make use of them. The short range just maybe isn't particularly great in combination with a slow movement. Things certainly could avoid it for a turn or so if they wanted to. Not being able to overwatch post the update in early 10th edition was a massive blow to this. I still feel like it kind of needed a points redress since that, and having handing out a battle shock test at special rule is a kind of underwhelming one too. Overall, I've chosen to rate the Valiant a 5 out of 10. It's one of the most rarely played big knights from the index in tournament play. Next up, we've got the Armiger Moirax, an Armiger equivalent for 160 points, kind of similar pros and cons to the rest of the Armigers, though he is more expensive and doesn't get a top-mounted weapon, so no stubber or melter gun for him. Probably the best advantage of these guys are their flexibility. There's 4 fairly interesting weapon profiles with various targets in mind, and it gets them actually fairly good anti-tank melee, more so than the Warglaive. A big d6 plus 2 damage with the claw, and also gets the built-in rag cleanser. I feel like the ranged weapons are all interesting, though maybe none of them are super standout. They all kind of have their own flaws. The conversion beamer does have good damage, but needs to be at really quite a specific range, greater than 12 inches but less than 24, otherwise it's probably going to do a whole load worse than a thermal spear. The grav guns are fairly general purpose but have low AP. The lightning lock AP 0 and damage 1 is going to stop it from threatening heavies, and the Volkite's quite swingy, needing 6s for the devastating wounds. I'm just not really convinced that any of them really beat the thermal spear and an extra gun, or just going nice and cheap for the Helverin if you're going for a dual range loadout where you save 20 points and get a bonus heavy stubber. He does get free heroic intervention as well, which definitely isn't awful, but kind of a bit situational, and also needs the melee loadout to really matter at all. In general, these guys are very rarely ever played in competitive. I've chosen to rank them a 6 out of 10. Realistically, I don't think that they're too bad, but just a bit directly inferior to the Warglaive and the Helverin for what they do. Next up for the Forge World Knights, there's the Questor Magera. The Forge World versions of the Questoris Knights get a 5+ invulnerable save in melee as well as at range, and that's one advantage there. And then the Magera itself gets a spammed Strength 9 AP 0 damage 2 gun with that lightning cannon, plus a plasma fusel and twin rag cleanser as well. Its bondsman abilities are ignore cover, which is genuinely quite nice for Helverins, and if it's damaged but not destroyed, it'll gradually heal itself, regaining D3 wounds per turn. Overall, I'm just not super convinced with this versus the other Questoris patterns. The invulnerable save in combat's nice enough, everything else kind of feels like sort of similar value or worse really, and it's not exactly cheaper than some of the other Questoris. I feel like perhaps the biggest weakness is the lightning cannon. Strength 9 AP 0 damage 2 is okay against some things, but just really not good against a lot. I feel like that's perhaps the single biggest downside for it. I've chosen to rate him a 4 out of 10 as a result, just as I think he's very heavily overshadowed. Otherwise, for the Questor Styrex, he's not so very different, but has a few different supporting rules. He also gets the 5+ invulnerable save that works in melee combat, and ignores cover that could be nice for Helverins. His big gun, I think I'm a little bit more convinced compared with the Magera. He has a Volkite gun that's strength 12, AP 0 and damage 3 with devastating wounds. I feel like the devastating wounds just keeps it a little bit more relevant against most things, but I still don't think it's a particularly great gun. Otherwise, he backs it up with a grav gun attack that allows you to have -2 to move, shoot and charge for one enemy unit. I feel like that is a handy enough debuff to push out against an enemy unit, could be quite disruptive as the knights are moving up the board. Again though, I feel like they're just going to struggle to really compete with the core index Questoris, a gun that's a bit more swingy and a bit more underwhelming, plus not being one of the more cheap ones, even if he does have a few other fun advantages. I've chosen to rate him a 5 out of 10 overall. Next up, we've got the Cerastus Knights. These are the fast-moving Torboy Knights. They get a bonus +2-inch move versus the Questoris, which can be genuinely meaningful when you're trying to make long charges and things, plus also gets an extra 3 wounds as well, which isn't too bad as an upgrade on the durability front. Beyond that, they're mostly kind of similar, though do lose the Carapace weapon, so no Storm Spear missiles for them. The Atropos is the sort of anti-tank and monster type knight. He gets his 5+ invulnerable save in melee like the Forge World Questoris versions, and then he's got 2 solid enough shooting profiles, one that's kind of similar to the Las Impulsor with the Las Cutter, and then D3 shots with the Graviton Singularity Cannon, shortish range but basically boosted Las cannons with strength 16 and AP 4. In melee he's maybe a bit more so-so, he only has damage 4 on the Las Cutter, only strength 7 AP 1 damage 2 on the sweep mode, even if he does get sustained hits, so he definitely does take a bit of a hit on the melee side of things. Basically as a prize for moving fast and being genuinely quite a big threat against tanks and vehicles, with the +1 to hit that he gets. Otherwise he gets extra buffs against enemy Titanic units. If you do happen to match up against them, they'll have a good time with +1 to wound, and also making Armigers do better against them as well. Overall I feel like he's a nice enough all-rounder, fairly solid shooting, fairly solid melee even if it is probably his biggest weak point, though he does get his invulnerable save in melee which can be quite nice against the right opponent. Overall I've chosen to rank him an 8 out of 10, they were being played from time to time in competitive lists before the points changes, and he did drop in points a bit. Next up, for the same price, we've got the Cerastus Acheron. This one's the one with the great big flame cannon, sort of a mini version of the Valiant one. He gets 2d6 shots at strength 8, AP 1 damage 2 rather than 3. Otherwise I just feel like he's overall not the best deal as a knight. He gets to strip cover when he's hit something with a flamestorm cannon, which isn't awful but also isn't spectacular for the primary weapon on a very expensive Titanic unit. And then a Battleshock Bondsman ability that's kind of hard to coordinate with trying to make them go into close combat. Overall, I just feel like his supporting rules aren't particularly great, and his main gun is certainly pretty underpowered, and he was a big loser when Knights could no longer overwatch anymore. Feels like they might have intentionally kept the gun a bit weak to account for that, and it just means that he's not really all that much threat outside of melee. Overall, just feels like he's a lot worse than his Cerastus rivals, or to be honest, most of the other Knights. I've chosen to rank him a 3 out of 10. Next up, we've got the Cerastus Castigator. This one's the one with the twin bolt cannon, so basically 2 Avenger Gatling cannons strapped together for twin links. You don't get devastating wounds, but being able to stack a bunch more saves on tough stuff is definitely helpful. I quite like his Bondsman ability as well. It gives you sustained hits 1 and boosts AP. It's quite a nice one for Helverins with their low AP autocannons. And his special rule is to suppress an enemy that he shot with his bolt cannon for a -1 to hit. Overall, again, I'd rate him as usable enough. That bolt cannon certainly fears him against the right targets, and is a bit more general purpose than the Warden's one perhaps. He does still lack things like the Storm Spear pods that the Warden gets though, and he is still going to struggle with things that are toughness 7 or more, even if the wound rerolls will help. Feels like he doesn't do too badly, but he is the priciest of the Questoris and Cerastus as well. I've chosen to rate him a 7 out of 10 overall. Feels maybe usable but not crazily standout. Finally, for the Cerastus pattern Knights, we've got the Cerastus Knight Lancer. I feel like if you want a dedicated melee close combat big knight, then this guy is the way to go. He's got a 4+ invulnerable save at range and melee from that big shield, so he doesn't need to rotate ion shields or anything like that. Basically hits like a gallant with the gauntlet kind of profile, and also gets lance on the big swing and a free tank shock. And then for actually getting to melee, he's going to be going very quickly. A 14-inch move built in is kind of hard to hide from, and really nice with the whole walking through walls thing that Knights can do now. The advance and charge ability for Bondsman could occasionally be useful, though it would mean usually giving up on the thermal spears of the Armigers, and he can just do a tiny bit of shooting as he charges in with a shock lance, hopefully strimming away a few light infantry or something. For his downsides, he is a little bit more expensive than the Gallant, though I feel like overall the upgrade to the 4+ invulnerable shield is probably worth it, never mind the extra speed. Though as with the Gallant, I feel like he's got the same weakness that as a dedicated melee knight, if the enemy is able to screen or tie him up, then he isn't going to be able to get to his intended prey, and that could mean that quite a lot of his good damage output is wasted. In any case though, I still think he's an interesting unit, certainly sees a bit of competitive play. I've chosen to rate him an 8 out of 10. Finally, we've got the big and stompy Acastus series Knights, both of them over 700 points, a massive great chassis that's got 30 wounds at toughness 13 with a 2+ save. That in itself can be basically too much for some armies to even consider taking down, and it might put them in the position where they're just going to be trying to basically destroy everything else on the board. I feel like having quite this many points invested in a single model though is kind of tricky in Warhammer 40k. It basically needs to be taking down multiple major threats each turn if it's going to be overall worth it, and they're kind of slow and you might be able to hide from them. And they've both got firepower that's really quite dedicated to taking down heavy hitters. If you're fighting against multiple small units or hordes or things, they're going to be very wasted. They can't take enhancements, and even if you wanted to do the entire role of destroying enemy monsters and vehicles and things, you still could do really quite well with things like the Castellan or maybe the Atropos. Like the Dominus Knights, being tagged in melee could be a really massive issue as well. Being unable to reposition with this much firepower to get lines of sight that you crucially need could be absolutely awful. Having said all that though about the negatives, what they do bring is just ridiculously enormous firepower. Both versions are basically the knights that you take if you want to destroy enemy knights. Maybe feel like a bit of a rock, paper, scissors kind of matchup. If you're fighting against enemy knights and super heavies, then having one of these along is probably going to be a big win. If you're fighting against basically anything else though, then you're probably going to be better off with multiple smaller knights. Out of the two, the Porphyrion gets its Magna las cannons with its D6 twin link shots with a big damage D6 plus 6 each, which is kind of crazy, plus some anti-fly missiles and lethal hits if static as well. For the Asterius, that's even more expensive at 765 points. This one gets its twin conversion beamers that have sustained hits when they're outside of 24-inch range, and these have got a really good chance of taking down basically any one single target that they take aim at, with further rules to amp up their damage against vehicles. They also get a little bit of indirect fire against infantry, but feels kind of token on something this big. Overall, chose to give the Porphyrion a 4 and the Asterius a 3 out of 10 on the power scale. I think they're rarely going to be a particularly good choice in competitive games unless everyone's running vehicles. But if you did happen to know that you were fighting knights or doing a big game when there were going to be lots of super heavies around, then they're probably going to be an okay unit. In any case, with the Forge World and Imperial Armour type knights talked about, that just about brings us to the end of this one. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Which Imperial Knights are you finding most effective on the tabletop right now? As mentioned earlier, feel free to check out the links in the video description if you'd like to enter for the giveaway, either the Patreon page or the Facebook page on the 1st of August, and the winners of those custom households will be announced on the 4th of the month. Otherwise, if you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep all these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.